France, May 1968. Between the end of World War II and 1968, the thought of large-scale revolt and revolution in France seemed laughably absurd. France, after all, was a modern, capitalist economy with a relatively high standard of living. Added onto this was the fact that the trade unions, which had been incredibly strong in the 1940s, diminished considerably in the post-war years. France's most prominent Marxist, André Gortz, has said in the beginning of 1968, "In the foreseeable future, there will be no crisis of European capitalism so dramatic as to drive the mass of workers to revolutionary general strikes or armed insurrections in support of their vital interests." And yet, to the surprise of everyone, later that year in May, France boasted the largest strike in human history up to that point, which considerably shook up French society and had permanent effects ever since. The cause of May 1968 movement was not one particular thing, but a multitude of factors that were steadily building over decades. The French left had failed to provide sufficient resistance to the Algerian War between 1954 and 1962. The war destabilized the Fourth Republic and allowed de Gaulle to take power with considerable ease. And while he maintained all the structures of bourgeois democracy, it was noticeably more authoritarian. In the ensuing decade, an intense campaign of modernization was undertaken. But with the left in decline, it led to many grave issues. Wages stagnated, unemployment had increased, particularly among the young, and working conditions had deteriorated considerably. Even though struggle was low and the left was weak, there was a definite attitude of discontentment that was present in French society. However, perhaps the largest factor at play in 1968 was the rapid expansion of higher education that was occurring all over France. The amount of French students had nearly tripled between 1958 and 1968, and this expansion was incredibly rapid and unplanned in many respects, as grads often had extreme difficulty finding careers in their given field. Over the 1960s in France, there was increasingly radicalization taking place in the student body. The causes of this was many. Influences included the Vietnam War, Third World guerrilla wars, and the Cultural Revolution in China. And just closer to home, the general poor working conditions of the working class, especially among young people. In the months leading up to May, there had been increased conflict between the authorities of the University of Paris and the students. Demands from the students were very diverse, the only central one being free circulation, that being the right for students to go to each other's dorms, which had been strictly gender segregated. Then, after a period of conflict between the two sides, the admins decided to close the Sorbonne campus on May 2nd. In response, students marched towards the Sorbonne campus where cops were guarding the campus. The students confronted the police and started to hold ground in the Latin district by using the Parisian roads to construct barricades and the roadstones to lob at cops. The situation only escalated from there, as non-student bystanders started to get involved and join the students. The Belgian Trotskyist Ernst Manuel was present at the time. He is said to have climbed the barricade and remarked, "How beautiful, it's the revolution." He was watching his own car burn. The police, of course, retaliated with a heavy hand, throwing tear gas and grenades, CS gas, and just generally clubbing and beating protesters. The government's heavy-handed approach led to the unions having sympathy for the movement, and they called for a one-day general strike on May 13th. The government folded and they reopened the Sorbonne, which caused the government to lose credibility as the police and the rightist forces saw this as weak and cowardly, and the protesters already hated the government for their brutality. Despite the government balking, however, the movement only grew from there, with mass demonstrations growing bigger and bigger by the day, gaining very diverse groups of workers. More unity was made between workers and students, with the main organizational form of revolutionary activity taking the form of small sects of militants made up of workers and students who would agitate workplaces. There were three main tendencies who played a role in these sects: anarchists, Maoists, and Trotskyists. And this is ironic considering that these groups tend to hate each other. But all three played a revolutionary role in this course of events. The unions had only called for a one-day strike and had officially ended it after the one day. However, the workers were still restless. Without the permission or direction of the unions, the workers themselves, with the support of the radical sects, began to continue their strikes and had actually started occupying their workplaces. This was entirely spontaneous and happened one by one all across workplaces in France, until it had functionally snowballed into a general strike. General strikes are by definition very different from normal strikes. Where a normal strike is about making demands of a single workplace, a general strike affects all of society and therefore must approach the question of power. In occupied workplaces, work was still being done, as all the necessary functions of work from production to distribution still needed to occur to maintain society, i.e., food still needs to be produced and distributed so that people may live. The difference was that workers themselves had removed the bosses and had begun to manage their own workplaces and the wider layer of society. For example, the highest level of struggle took place on the city of Nantes. The Sud Aviation aircraft factory there had decided early on that it would continue the one-day strike of May 13th, and they occupied the workplace. This was in large part due to a small Trotskyist group agitating the factory workplace. During this occupation, the workers locked the management in a room and blasted the Internationale at them 24/7 until the workers themselves grew sick of it and shut it off. The occupations then spread to the entire city of Nantes, placing virtually the entire city in workers' control. The workers controlled traffic in and out of the city, they managed resources and production, they negotiated the local farmers directly to provide food. The lack of the middlemen meant that the food was significantly cheaper. The necessities of life, normally taken for granted, now appeared visibly as the products of human labor. This is what is called dual power, where institutions of worker control compete with those of the government. And then the question arises, who's really in control? Situations like these were occurring all across France, though typically not to the extent it occurred in Nantes. Though the unions maintained formal control of the strike, the radical work was undertaken by action committees, which carried out two kinds of work. One, they would undertake direct aid work like food distribution. Two, they would do informational work, creating and distributing radical propaganda. Another important part of the movement was the contribution of immigrant workers, who got involved as France had a high population of immigrant workers at the time that came from Iberia, North Africa, and the Caribbean. The strike allowed for an increase in solidarity between these immigrant workers and non-French immigrant people. As it became clear, both groups gained from the mutual solidarity. One failure, however, of the movement was its lack of any specific organization or articulation of women's issues. In fact, some aspects of the movement had overly macho tones. This was prior to the newly emerging women's movement coming to France. As stated earlier, this snowballing of the general strike was entirely due to the spontaneity of the workers, yet the unions, like the CGT, held all the formal power. The union bureaucracy, despite being the self-appointed leaders of the strike, were openly hostile to the mass participation that the movement led to. The main reason for this is that the mass participation of the workers is a challenge to the union's power and to the position of the bureaucrats. The job of the union is to be an intermediary between labor and capital, so labor self-organizing undercuts their authority and their job. So their leadership was in a bind. On the one hand, it was not in their interest to empower the workers and escalate the strike. On the other hand, they still had to represent the workers and carried out strikes so that they did not lose total legitimacy in the eyes of their members. The strike was formally organized through strike committees. During the beginning of these strikes, when they were being formed, the unions made sure to only place union bureaucrats and loyal workers in, and to deliberately exclude radicals. One effect of this was that radical workers could sense that they were not being welcomed and stopped organizing in workplaces to focus squarely on the streets and in the larger movement. Of the French left at the time, the biggest group was the French Communist Party, the PCF, which had had a very prominent role in French society and was the most intertwined with the CGT. Prior to the movement, their primary goal was returning to electoral power after getting kicked out of the government some years before. They were openly against the revolution in the context of France and only sought to return to power through legal parliamentary means. They were, at the beginning of the movement, openly hostile to it for two reasons. One, they felt the movement would hurt their electoral chances in the long run, as they believed in respectability politics and didn't want to be associated with actual revolutionaries and radicals in the mind of voters. And two, they saw themselves as the only Marxist current that was the furthest left in French society, so any group claiming otherwise was a direct attack on their self-perceived image. So, they originally claimed that the students were reactionaries who were the overly privileged children of managers who were only interested in causing destruction and mayhem and therefore had nothing in common with the working class. Subtle. However, given the snowballing of the movement and its increased support, the PCF was forced to come out supporting the strike. And because of its close relationship to the CGT, it ended up being the formal political leadership of the whole movement, despite its tenuous relationship with it. Along with the PCF, there were two other former left political groups, that being the Socialist Party, the PSU, and the Left Federation. Both of these groups were similar to the PCF in that they were only focused on electoral victory and co-opted the movement for their own benefit. The actual revolutionary groups were very small and isolated, overshadowed by larger and more bureaucratic orgs, and so lacked the required coordination and revolutionary leadership needed for such a crucial time, though their work was admirable nonetheless. Returning to how the French government was handling this, and the answer is not well. While both CGT and the government had been in negotiations, the workers rejected the trinket reforms that came out of the first round. Briefly, there was a power vacuum in the government involving politicking around de Gaulle as he had fled the country. However, that was resolved, and when he came back on May 30th, he gave the Union a simple choice through a radio broadcast. Either agree to the free parliamentary elections and end the strike now, or we call in the army and end this by force. The PCF flinched, and being the electoralists they were, they couldn't risk not appearing to respect parliamentary rule. So they did what any self-identified communist would do, and they fully ended a movement advancing towards communist revolution in favor of bourgeois democracy. Yep, a totally communist thing to do. And so the strike and the May movement came to an abrupt end with no agreement being met. Elections were organized not too long after. The main irony of the legacy of the strike, for the left parties who co-opted the movement, is that they ended up doing terribly in the elections. Both the Communist and the Socialist parties lost seats, in large part due to their betrayal and distrust of the movement. Only the more centrist Left Federation gained some seats, and they were the only group that was the most supportive of the movement from the beginning. The PCF had ended the movement with the realist hope of looking respectable to gain support for an electoral victory. Once again, however, the PCF proved that realists are often the greatest utopians, and of course, the reformists never learned much from this. They were so concerned with their parliamentary image that they kept on whining that it was leftist violence that was losing them votes.